In the third part of my critique of Wolfgang Streeck, I wanted to finish my comments on the European Bretton Woods proposal, and because there is a historical precedent to that, and I want to conclude with some methodological thoughts in social sciences. With regard to the European Bretton Woods system, there have been some experiments in the 1970s around the Bretton Woods system with a 2.25% um, band in terms of the currencies. So there was one currency that was at the center, which back in the days had been the U.S. dollar and then later the Deutschmark, and within a band of 2.25%, the other currencies in the European uh, Union could fluctuate and deviate from the leading currency. But the pattern of that policy consisted of the Deutschmark revaluations and other currencies devaluation. But there was a lack of predictability in that system, and so the EU devised the European monetary system in 1979, which came to replace first the Bretton Woods, which was already abolished in 71, and the kind of like experimenting period that came throughout the 1970s. But this was an imperfect solution in itself, because we can see the speculative attacks by investors like George Soros against the Italian lira and the British pound. That move encouraged further monetary integration. The difficulty of effective monetary policy is summarized under the heading of the Mundell trilemma, um, the, which is, you can either have, monetary independence, free capital movements, or fixed exchange rate, two of the three, but not all of the three at the same time. The EU countries eventually sacrificed monetary independence in order to get free capital movements, which had been in place for a long time, at least since the 70s, and they gained the fixed exchange rate, which was the euro. But the hoped for abatement of speculative attacks only happened on the currency level. It did not happen um, on the government debt level, where investors in fact made very heavy speculative attacks against high debt countries. We have seen these patterns happen in Italy, in Spain, Greece, Portugal. And that was as a result of the financial crisis, which was rolling out in 2011 and 2012. And it was only stopped when the ECB came in and added liquidity into the financial system. So those are, some thoughts about, whether or not it is actually possible to add a European-style Bretton Woods system. But aside from that, I will make my overall conclusion about the book. While I think that Streeck did an arguably superb job in describing the problem plaguing the advanced capitalist countries, I am also of the opinion that the solutions that he is thinking about only scratch the surface. Why would I say that? Well, I think he diagnosed the problem to be that of a fundamental crisis of the capitalist economic system, and that this serious crisis of legitimacy among business people and investors makes it exceedingly difficult for policymakers to find good solutions, such that they can only resort to short-term policies to buy time and to delay the crisis. Again, inflation, more debt in the private sector, and central bank money printing. Now, why would currency devaluation and the new Bretton Woods system make such a big difference? I don't necessarily see that point here. These policies are at best going to buy a few more years, but will not reconcile the conflicting interests between what Streeck considered the Staatsvolk and the Marktvolk. I don't doubt that the European institutional framework needs to be more democratic. But if we compare the EU to, say, the US or Japan, which are other developed countries, they don't have the peculiar European currency problem, and yet they suffer from similar problems of massive growth slowdown, skyrocketing profits in the private sector, wage stagnation, record indebtedness in the state and private household sector, and growing inequality. So something else must be at work here besides the Hayekian liberalization straitjacket. If we consider the main problem of the capitalist economy today to be the lack of market confidence, then Streeck and other scholars should demand at the very least some kind of Marshall Plan, with the express purpose of creating full employment policies, followed by expressly pro-labor union policies to at least put a dent on the current extreme levels of inequality, and in order to level the playing field in favor of workers. Streeck seems overall to be very imprecise about what he considered to be democratic policy making, and strangely restricted its definition to the ability of national governments to print their own currency. Yet I think there's a broader set of policy ideas that have to be available to produce more democratic outcomes, and I think the example has been given to us by Thomas Piketty in his book Capital in the 21st Century. His idea is to raise a wealth tax, which may be as low as 1% on assets above 1 million euros, or a financial transaction tax estimated to be 0.5% of global GDP. The German Trade Federation argues that a small wealth tax can generate 200 to 250 billion euros in revenues to finance a New Deal infrastructure investment program across Europe. So there's a lot of options that are out there. And then there's a possibility of reneging debts, which Streeck did not mention, though only as a general proposal without much detail. I mean, there's important questions that are left unaddressed. For example, how much of a haircut is realistic and desirable? Another idea which Streeck disputes in the spirit of Hayek is a centralized EU that pursues democratic goals. But that kind of outcome, a federation, a EU federation, which actually does pursue democratic goals of full employment and wage policies, would be the best way to prevent the self-defeating internal competition and race to the bottom that happens between and among nation states. The big question for intellectuals is that they have to choose, what is the ultimate outcome? What is the ultimate goal and policy? Well, I see two options here. Do whatever it takes, number one, do whatever it takes to restore market confidence by state regulation, state investment, leveling political power between workers and capitalists. And this is what we now know as Keynesian policy. The second is to do something else entirely. Recognize that we can't continue to buy more time. It's quite frankly very costly and very bothersome. Let's try to find ways to transcend the profit-based capitalist system and its associated contradictions. Though I will concede that that kind of outcome is by no means clear. I mean, what does it mean to transcend capitalism? Is that a return to state-controlled socialism? Is that a libertarian, worker-centered socialism, or otherwise known as anarcho-syndicalism? Or is it a combination of the two? So these are the policies, ideas that are out there, but it's not clear about the solutions. But despite the aforementioned shortcomings, Streeck's book does provide an excellent insight into the problems and contradictions of democratic capitalism, which in itself is a significant scholarly contribution which is all too often neglected in the very small scale and highly focused research projects that occupy contemporary social scientists. Some scholars might argue that problems in political economy have simply become so complicated that even the most erudite scholars have no choice but to restrict themselves to very narrow and small empirical and theoretical problems without making grand generalizations which can be refuted and lack substance. But I would disagree with that position. Treading carefully in the footsteps of thinkers like Marx, Schumpeter, or Ricardo provides a solid methodological framework to think about big economic questions, which of course have to be critically evaluated in every new historical context that contains different actors and data points. In my opinion, it is not the lack of scholarly comprehension, but the fear of violating social norms and politically permissible views which deter and discourage the more critical social scientific inquiry a la Streeck. One of Streeck's favorite sociologists is C. Wright Mills, who not coincidentally produced uproar in the US of the 1950s after attacking the entire elite power structure of the country during the height of the McCarthy era. It might be true that the emperor wears no clothes, but it is still discomforting to point it out to him. I conclude with one more methodological note. Streeck is by training a sociologist who is absorbed with the problems of capitalism and takes trouble with fellow sociologists whose insight neglect broader historical and economic inquiries. This critique is not necessarily confined to sociologists. I mean, we definitely see that among economists as well, as Thomas Piketty pointed out in his book. But Streeck noted in his preface, I quote, "More often than not, I miss the kind of worldly realism to be found in a book such as C. Wright Mills' The Power Elite. And to this day I soon become bored with sociology from which histories, local color, and the exotic, often absurd side of social and political life are absent. Although I therefore travel light in terms of theory, my theme here, the financial and fiscal crisis of the wealthy capitalist democracies, does require me to connect with the rich theoretical tradition of political economy. This is because unless the sociology of social crises and the political theory of democracy learn to conceive of the economy as a field of social political activity, they inevitably fall wide of the mark, as does any conception of the economy and polity in society that leaves out of account the present capitalist form of organization. After what has happened in 2008, no one can understand politics and political institutions without closely relating them to markets and economic interests, as well as to the class structures and conflicts arising from them." Unquote. Well, I couldn't put it better. Finally, the kind of questions that readers of Streeck are left with depend very much on the intellectual and ideological preferences of the reader. I'm just going to ask them, what is the future of the euro? What is the future of Europe? What is the future of the consolidation state? What is the future of debt accumulation of states? What is the future of economic growth? How do we reawaken capitalists' animal spirit, as Keynes called it, of investing in the real economy? What can we do to make Europe more democratic? How will the Staatsfolge and Marktfolge resolve itself? And others might ask, how can we accelerate Hayekian-style liberalization, deregulation, and privatization? How can we achieve liberalization with the least amount of social resistance? But for me, the most interesting question, and more broadly speaking, what is the future of capitalism itself?